Hello world, hello Philippines. For today's lesson video, we're going to discuss the development of the scoring rubric. Rubrics can help clarify your expectations and will show students how to meet them, making students accountable for their performance in an easy to follow format. The feedback that students receive through a grading rubric can help them improve their performance or revise a subsequent work. Here are, of course, our expected learning outcomes for this lesson. First, explain what a scoring rubric is and, of course, cited the parts of a scoring rubric. The second is distinguish between holistic and analytic rubrics and between general and task-specific rubric. The third is cited the importance of a scoring rubric. The fourth is constructed a holistic and an analytic rubric based on a given learning outcome or competency. Next is distinguish among scoring rubric, the checklist, and of course the rating scale. And of course, created checklist and rating scale as an output. As teachers, of course, we have queries to be attended. Here are some probably questions that students would ask. Like, for example, how am I doing? Or what is really making me think? Okay, then how will I know if my work is good? And what do I need to do to improve? And another question is, how am I going to make this improvement? Or what are my targets? Another question probably is that where do I have to focus my revisions? Another is what can I remember and understand? And another question is, am I learning in the best way for me? Okay, and the last probably is that what are my strengths and weaknesses? So these are the queries that probably we need to answer. And part of this queries can be solved using, of course, the assessment. And having, of course, an assessment requires us to have rubrics. Probably you will ask, what is a scoring rubric? Okay, a scoring rubric is a coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of level of performance, quality on the criteria. The second is according to Macmillan. He defines these as scoring guide that uses criteria to differentiate between levels of student proficiency. And according to Popham, he describes these as scoring procedures for judging students' responses to performance tests. Let's have other definition of rubrics. A rubric is, of course, a guideline for rating a student performance. A rubric is a scoring tool that lists, of course, the criteria or what counts for a piece of work. Another is, it is an evaluation tool that describes quality of work on a range from excellent to poor. Okay, and of course, a rubric can be a communication tool. What are, of course, the characteristics of good rubrics? Okay, a good rubric, of course, do what you want them to do and assess what you want to assess. Okay, rubrics, of course, are good if they are, of course, pleasing to look at and are easy on the eyes. Of course, it should be clear to everyone and are not too big or small for their purpose. Another characteristic is that it should be reliable, valid, fair, and completely connected to what you are assessing. And of course, everybody understands the same thing when they read one, but they can still be, of course, scary. Let's have, of course, the basic steps to design rubric. The first is we need to identify a learning goal. The second one is we need to choose outcomes that may be measured with a rubric, because not all of your outcomes can be measured by the rubric. The third one is develop or adopt an existing rubric. The fourth is share it with, of course, our students. Then number five, or the fifth, is assess the grade, or grade, of course, our rubric. And of course, number six is analyze and report our results. Let's have, of course, the essential parts of the rubric. You can see, of course, a sample rubric wherein you can have, of course, the parts. So the first is, of course, the criterion. So you can see there, it's the participation that we have, okay, as, of course, the criterion. Okay, and we have, of course, a scale of points, like, for example, 4 or A or 10. Okay, and then we have, of course, the performance level, such as excellent, good, satisfactory, marginal pass, or fail. And then, of course, the last is descriptors for performance levels. As for example, in the satisfactory, you can have, okay, the descriptor as occasionally involved and engaged, little enthusiasm, needs constant guiding and or prompting. Okay, however, in the marginal pass, for example, is little to no participation, then hampers others, often late, inconsistent response to guiding or prompting. Okay, and of course, if you're going to have a fail or a zero, okay, score or scale of points, you have, of course, non-submission, okay, or of course, there is plagiarism of the work. Okay, let's define first criteria. When we say, of course, criteria is one or more traits or dimensions that serve as the basis for judging the student response. Like, for example, participation there. Okay, then we have, of course, the descriptors. It spell out what is expected of students at each level of performance for each criterion. Again, the essential parts of our rubric are, the first is criterion. We have also a scale of points. We have performance levels. And of course, the descriptors for performance levels. Okay, let's have this question. Why include level of performance? Okay, having, of course, the level of performance will, of course, give us the clear expectations. The same way, of course, with the students, then more consistent and objective assessment. And of course, we have a better feedback. Okay, let's have, of course, the types of rubric that we can have. So we have, of course, the holistic. When we say, of course, holistic, all criteria is lumped together and evaluated simultaneously, which makes it faster to create and grade. So take a look with, of course, the example, okay, that we have, wherein you can have a general, okay, scoring. Like you will have, of course, 1 to 4 only for the score, and you can see, of course, the description of each. Okay, when we say holistic rubric, it assigns a level of performance by assessing performance across multiple criteria as a whole. And holistic rubric, or rubrics rather, provide a single score based on an overall impression of a student's performance on a task. And it is used to score students' work as a whole, yielding one holistic score. The question is that when to use holistic rubrics. Okay, here are, of course, the answers of the question. Okay, the first is, there is no correct answer or response to us a task. For example, creative work. And the focus is on overall quality, proficiency, or understanding of a specific content or skills. Another is the assessment is summative. For example, at the end of the semester or major. And of course, assessing significant numbers. Like, for example, there are 150 students in the class and you are having, of course, portfolio. So it's really hard to check if you're going to have analytic rubric. So we, of course, prefer to have holistic rubric for that. Okay, here is an example of holistic rubric that you can have. Supposing this is an activity. So the highest, of course, score that you can give or the students can get is 5. Okay, having, of course, the description demonstrates complete understanding of the problem and all requirements of tasks are included in a response. Supposing there is no submission or there is no output, of course, you will give 0 for no response or task not attempted. So if you are going to notice, it's very simple to have the holistic rubric, okay, to be used for any activity or performance task that we have. Okay, let's have the second one. The second one is, of course, the analytic rubric. And you can see its criterion is evaluated separately, which gives, of course, specific feedback to the teacher and the student about performance. For example, you have, of course, the criteria such as food, presentation, and comfort. So you can get 1 for beginning, 2 for developing, 3 for accomplished, and of course, 4 for exemplary. So this is actually the same rubric that we use, okay, in the holistic for breakfast in best analytic rubric. Here you can see food, presentation, and of course, comfort evaluated separately. When we say analytic rubric, it articulates, of course, the levels of performance for each criterion. So the teacher can assess students' performance or assess rather students' performance on each criterion. So that is, of course, analytic rubric. Okay, let's, of course, discuss more about analytic rubric. So when we say analytic rubrics, it provides specific feedback along several dimensions and descriptors of the product. And it breaks, of course, the objective into components parts. And each portion is scored independently using a rating scale. And the final score is made up of adding each component parts. Okay. Question is, when to use analytic rubrics? Of course, we have the following answer. The first is if there are several faculty and are collectively assessing student work. And then outside audiences will, of course, be examining rubric scores. And the last is the profiles of specific strengths, okay, or weaknesses are desired. So these are the reasons why we need to use, of course, analytic rubrics. Okay, here is an example of an analytic rubric wherein you can see, of course, the criteria, such as criteria 1, criteria 2, criteria 3, criteria 4, and you can see, of course, the score for beginning, developing. Okay, supposing you give 2, accomplished, or exemplary. Okay, let's have the description or descriptor, okay, for exemplary. So supposing for criteria number 1, you're going to give 4. So the description is that description reflecting highest level of performance. Okay. And if supposing you're going to give 1 for beginners, let's have, of course, criteria 4. So description is, of course, a reflection of beginning level of performance. So that's it. Okay. Let's have, of course, the differences between the holistic and analytic rubric. So you can see when we say holistic, okay, holistic rubrics, of course, provide a single score based on an overall impression of a student's performance on a task. While, of course, analytic rubric provides specific feedback along several dimensions. Okay, for the advantages, okay, when we say, of course, holistic, it is quick scoring. You can easily score it. Okay, then provides overview of students' achievement. While for analytic, it is more detailed feedback. And then, of course, scoring more consistent across students and, of course, the graders. The graders are, for example, the teachers. Okay, and for the disadvantages, okay, for holistic, It does not provide, of course, detailed information and may be difficult to provide one overall score. However, in the analytic, of course, it is time consuming to score because you have a lot of criteria, okay, to, of course, be given points. So that's it. That's, of course, the differences between holistic and analytic rubrics. Okay. I have here a question, how to decide on appropriate criteria? So the criteria should be the most appropriate and most important aspects of quality work, for example, performance or a product. So as described in the learning outcomes, and of course, not characteristics of the performance or the product task itself. We have, of course, these are characteristics of criteria for classroom rubrics. Okay, so here are, of course, the characteristics that we can have. So the criteria are, number one, it should be appropriate. So each criterion represents, of course, an aspect of a standard, curricular goal, or instructional goal or objective that students are intended to learn. The second, of course, characteristics that we have is it should be definable. So each criterion has a clear, agreed upon meaning that both students and teachers understand. The third is, of course, observable. So each criterion describes a quality in the performance that can be perceived, seen, or heard, usually, and by someone, of course, other than the person performing. Okay, the fourth is, of course, distinct from one another. So each criterion identifies a separate aspect of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. Okay, the fifth is, of course, it should be complete. All the criteria together describe the whole of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. And the last is it able to support these descriptions along a continuum of quality. So each criterion can be described over a range of performance levels. So here are, of course, these are characteristics of criteria for classroom rubrics. Again, these characteristics are appropriate, definable, observable, distinct from one another. It should be complete and able to support descriptions along a continuum of quality. Okay, let's have another type of rubrics. We have, of course, the general rubrics and, of course, task-specific rubric. Okay, when we say, of course, general rubrics, it contains criteria that are general across tasks. So the advantage of this is that it can use the same rubric across different tasks. However, the disadvantage is that feedback may not be specific enough. Okay, to continue, of course, having the discussion of general rubrics. Okay, these general rubrics are particularly useful for fundamental skills, such as, of course, example writing, okay, mathematics, problem solving, and of course, the general traits like creativity. Okay, while, of course, the task-specific rubrics are unique to specific tasks, and we have, of course, the following advantage, or we have, of course, disadvantage. Okay, it's more reliable assessment of performance on the task, while the disadvantage is that it's difficult to construct rubrics for all specific tasks. Okay, here is, of course, an example of a general rubric, okay, wherein you can have, of course, the scoring. So the highest is also 4, then 3 rather. We have, of course, 2, 1, okay, and 1. So for example, we have the following criteria. Okay, so the criteria are concepts, classification. Okay, so if you're going to give 3, okay, this is the description, okay, or descriptor. So identifies concepts, clarifies them, and of course formulates verifiable hypothesis on process or the problem solving. Okay, then we have, of course, for another criterion, principles, sequences, for example. So if you're going to give 1, okay, this is the description. Okay, so performs the procedures, collects and organizes data, okay, and makes wrong conclusions. Another probably criterion that you have is, of course, the evaluation of creativity. So supposing if we're going to give 2 points for the students, okay, this is the description or descriptor. The result coincide only partly with the concepts and, of course, assumptions made. Okay, so this is an example of the general rubric that we can have. Okay, then we have also a task-specific rubric, for example. So these are actually written for specific classroom task or assignment. Take note of the word specific. Okay, and include language that specifically connects the rubric to a task or to the task or assignment students will complete. Okay, so this is actually a task-specific rubric for both design. Okay, and you can have, of course, novice, boat builder. You have, of course, apprentice, boat builder. You have master boat builder, and of course, mentor boat builder. Let's have, supposing you give, okay, for the criterion, the first, okay, you have, of course, the mentor boat builder. So this is the descriptor or description. My boat floated, moved, and stayed all right, airtight rather, along past the end of the time trial. So supposing that's it. Okay, so this is an example of course, the specific, task specific rather, rubric. Okay, let's have the importance of rubric. Okay, rubric, of course, helps the teachers teach. Then the second is, of course, rubrics help students learn. And of course, the last, students, rubrics rather help coordinate instruction and assessment. Okay, let's have, of course, the checklist. Okay, so what we have mentioned, it is a checklist is a list of response categories that correspond, or that respondents rather check if appropriate. So you just probably do the checking. The checklist is a selected list of words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs following which an observer records a check mark to denote a presence or absence of whatever is being observed. And it is a basic example. No? A basic example rather is to do list. So wherein, of course, you're going to check if it's being attained or not. Okay, so a checklist is a list of specific characteristics, okay, with a place for marking whether the characteristics is present or absent. Let's have an example of my sentence checklist. Okay, so the instruction is that students will, of course, check if it is present. If not, probably X. Okay, so for example, begins with a capital letter. So that's a sentence should begin with a capital letter. So you check if that is correct in your work. So it ends with a period or a question mark or an exclamation point. So a sentence should end with a period or a question mark or exclamation point. Kindly check, supposing you have a sentence, kindly check if it ends with, of course, these three. Okay, another is a complete thought, and of course has a naming part, like for example, subject, and a telling part is predicate. Okay, another, of course, definition of the checklist that we have, okay, is it also used to make sure students have followed directions for an assignment, that they have all the required parts of some project, or that they have followed format requirements for a report. For example, this is the research report checklist. Okay, so a research should have an introduction, has a thesis sentence or a research question, then has at least resources, and of course, it includes a chart or a design. So these are, of course, the characteristics of the research report that we can have. Okay, let's have the rating scale. Okay, let's first define what is a rating. Okay, so when we say, of course, rating, it is the term used to express opinion or judgment regarding, of course, some performance of a person, object, okay, situation, and character. And the rating scale involves, of course, qualitative descriptions. Take note, qualitative descriptions of limited number of aspects of a thing or traits of a person. So this, okay, is a rating scale. Another definition of the rating scale is that it is a list of specific characteristics with a place for marking the degree to which each characteristics is displayed. And a scale with, of course, a set of opinion which describes varying degree of the dimensions of an attitude or a phenomenon being observed. Okay, here is, of course, the scale that we use in a rating scale. So for example, you have, of course, always, frequently, sometimes, and never. Okay, you have actually 4 choices or options. Then we have consistently, often, sometimes, rarely. Okay, then always, usually, sometimes, and never. Okay, we have also these almost always, usually, often, occasionally, rarely, very rarely, and never. Okay, take note 4 choices are usually sufficient. Okay, as illustrated, other numbers of options can be also used. And with regards to the scale, okay, this is the typical use. Okay, so to rate how often students exhibit behaviors or learning skills. Example, so works independently or follows direction, completes homeworks, for example. So you have, of course, the 4 scales. 4 scales. So we have of supposing always, frequently, sometimes, and never. So to rate how often students have certain feelings or attributes about their work. For example, I am confident of my work. Okay, so students would answer always, or usually, or sometimes, or never. So that's it. Okay. So we have, of course, the types of the rating scale that we have. Okay, the first is, of course, the graphic rating scale. Then we have also this descriptive rating scale. Okay, the next is, of course, the numerical rating scale, and of course, the comparative rating scale. So these are the 4 types of rating scales that we can use. Okay, for our references for this lesson, we have, of course, the following. Okay, I hope you enjoyed, of course, our discussion for today. Okay, may, of course, you learn a lot of, you have learned probably a lot of things from this discussion. Thank you and see you for another lesson video. God bless everybody.